Good evening and welcome to tonight's Tisch College Distinguished Speaker Series with activist, author, and entrepreneur Stacey Abrams. I'm Kelly Sims Gallagher. I'm the academic dean and professor of energy and environmental policy at the Fletcher School, and I direct the Climate Policy Lab and Center for International Environment and Resource Policy there. I want to thank our co-sponsors for their partnership and support, including Tufts Civic, Tufts Action, the Africana Center, the Political Science Department, the Fletcher School, and the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. As you may know, Tisch College has many events and civic leaders visiting campus virtually this year. And next week, also in partnership with Fletcher, we will host former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Michelle Flournoy. And in the following weeks, we'll host leaders including Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, former RNC Chair Michael Steele, New Jersey Governor and First Lady Murphy, Jane Goodall, and more. You can find out more information and register for those opportunities by visiting tischcollege.tufts.edu/events. For folks in the Zoom room tonight, there is going to be an opportunity for you to ask questions. Please submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time, and then Tisch staff will be in touch with you directly for additional instructions. And we will try to get to as many questions as possible at the event. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Stacey Abrams and Dean Alan Solomont. I first met Stacey Abrams 27 years ago, which was a little shocker when I did the math. We were juniors in college and newly selected Truman Scholars. I was from Colorado and Stacey from Mississippi. We came from totally different parts of the country, but we became friends. A few years later, we worked together on a document called The Content of Our Character, Voices of Generation X. I read it again last night for the first time in many years. I co-authored the section on America's politics, and Stacey co-edited the whole document, and specifically the section on America's civil society. Two sentences really stood out for me as standing the test of time. The first, courageous leadership spurns conventional wisdom and swims against the tide of what is easy and politically expedient towards what is noble both in cause and deed. And second, with human dignity as our constant mission and accountability as our instrument of measure, we can realize ethical leadership in America's civil society. And here's the document. Oh, you can't see. Anyway, I have it in front of me. Stacey Abrams is the embodiment of courageous and ethical leadership. She has never taken the easy path. She has been noble in both cause and deed. She recognizes the inherent dignity in every person and has held our institutions and leaders accountable, most recently in the 2020 election. After serving for 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, 7 as minority leader, Abrams became the Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia in 2018. For the gubernatorial election, where she won more votes than any other Democrat in state history. She was the first Black woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the United States, and the first Black woman and first Georgian to deliver a response to the State of the Union. As a result of that election, Abrams launched Fair Fight to ensure every American has a voice in our election system through programs such as Fair Fight 2020, an initiative to fund and train voter protection teams in 20 battleground states. The incredible impact of Fair Fight led to Stacey being named to the Forbes list of world's most powerful women last year. She's founded multiple organizations devoted to voting rights and training and hiring people of color. In 2019, she launched Fair Count to ensure accuracy in the 2020 census and greater participation in public and civic engagement. And she also launched the Southern Economic Advancement Project, a public policy initiative to broaden economic power and build equity in the South. And as if that wasn't all enough, she's also a New York Times bestselling author. She's written 8 novels under the pen name Selena Montgomery, in addition to her books on political leadership, including her most recent book, which is called Lead from the Outside. I have to say, on a personal note, that none of her accomplishments have surprised me. I've admired her character, courage, kindness, vision, and humanity since the day I met her. Joining Stacey in conversation today is Alan Salamont, the Pierre and Pamela Omidyar Dean of Tisch College. A lifelong social and political activist, Dean Salamont previously served as the US ambassador to Spain and Andorra under President Obama, for whom I also worked. Before serving in Spain, Salamont chaired the bipartisan board of directors of the Corporation for National and Community Service, the federal agency that oversees such domestic service programs like AmeriCorps, Learn and Serve America, VISTA, and Senior Corps. He first got his exposure to national politics as a Tufts undergrad in 1968 when he worked as a page at the tumultuous Democratic National Convention in Chicago. He later served as the party's national finance chair from 1997 to 1998 and played key roles in the presidential campaigns of John Kerry, Al Gore, Bill Clinton, and Michael Dukakis. He's been a lifelong supporter of Tufts, having served as an instructor, senior fellow, founding board chair, and now dean of Tisch College, parent, alumni, and trustee. And without further ado, it's a great pleasure to introduce Stacey Abrams and Dean Salamont.
Kelly, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's been a pleasure to work with you on this event and to reunite you with your dear and longtime friend. Thank you, Stacey, for joining us tonight. We've had over 3,800 people register, so clearly the Tufts community is very excited to hear what you have to say. But before we get started, I want to acknowledge the violent attacks that happened in Atlanta and Ackworth on Tuesday. It left 8 people murdered, 6 of whom were Asian women. This tragedy should be condemned in the clearest and strongest way possible. And if you haven't read it already, I urge our audience to read President Monaco's statement that went out earlier today to the Tufts community, and to be on the lookout for helpful resources and opportunities for reflection and action that the university will share in the coming days. What happened in Atlanta is no isolated incident. Over the past year, violence against Asian American, and Pacific Islander communities has increased by 150% in this country, and by 100% in the Boston area. Even at Tufts, we've seen an increase in incidences of bias. So I just want to say to the members of the Tufts community who are Asian or of Asian descent, we are thinking of you. We support you and we stand in solidarity with you. And to the broader community, I urge you to do your part in rooting out hatred. As President Monaco said in his statement, all of us at Tufts can actively participate in confronting bigotry regardless of where we might encounter it. Thank you. And now, Stacey Abrams, I thought I'd start the conversation by asking you a question. You are a hero to millions of Americans. Who are some of your heroes?
Well, first of all, Dean Salamont, thank you so much. And to my friend Kelly Sims Gallagher. She was Kelly Sims when I first met her. And one of the kindest things she did for me was during the very impoverished years of graduate school, let me sleep on her couch a couple of times when I had to come through town. And she has been just such a good and kind person for the entirety of our entirely too long, 27 years is just a really long time of our friendship. So it's a pleasure to be here. My heroes are, I began at home. My parents are extraordinary people. They grew up in the abject poverty that you think about in Mississippi during Jim Crow. My dad was arrested at the age of 14 because he was organizing and registering Black people to vote during Jim Crow. My mom was doing the same work, but we tease him that she managed not to get caught. but they both believe, and it is lived in word and deed every day. They believe in human dignity. They believe in a right to be heard. And they have spent their lives in pursuit of justice, even as they worked full time, both working hard every day, but never quite getting above working class, usually falling into working class poverty. They never let that stop them from making sure that we were engaged in social activism and service and in pursuit of justice. And when you're willing to do right by others, even when right is not being done to you, that to me is an example of a hero.
And they brought you to Atlanta, where they both became Methodist ministers, went to Emory University.
Yes.
So you were a bit of a prodigy, excuse me.
Okay.
At the age of 17, you were still in high school. You were hired as a typist for a congressional campaign, but they switched you to a speechwriter based on the edits that you made while typing. At what point in your life did you decide to make politics your calling? And why did you make that choice?
So as I said, I grew up in a family that was very committed to social justice. My parents would take us with them to protest. They would take us with them to vote, but they also took us with them to volunteer. So we worked at soup kitchens and homeless shelters. We would go to juvenile justice facilities. We spent time in housing projects, teaching young people to read because the school system was not doing its job. And it was good work. It was what we were raised to do. But I think I was around 10 or 11, and I was missing the Super Friends for yet another Saturday. And for those of you who are too young to understand this, it used to be that Saturday morning cartoons literally only came on Saturday morning. You missed it, you were done. And so we were off, doing something, and we were poor too. So we're like, Mom and Dad, you do realize we're the people you should be serving. And my parents would say, look, having nothing is not an excuse for doing nothing. But on that day, I said, look, I know that we are doing the right thing, but how are the two of you and the six of us, I'm the second of six kids, how are basically 8 Black people going to fix Mississippi? Like, this seemed to me to be a gargantuan task and not likely. And, my mom and dad said, look, it's government's job to do many of these things for people who've fallen through the cracks. It's government that should be trying to solve the challenges of poverty and literacy. It is why we have this communal sense of obligation. We create government so that together we deliver for each other. And so I was really mad at government because government was making sure I didn't get to watch the Super Friends. And so I not quite that naive a sense, but I really wanted to understand, how do we make government work better? Because I spent every weekend seeing the places and the spaces where things had just broken and fallen apart. I didn't plan to run for office myself. I intended to work on the inside. When Kelly and I were students, we were in the Truman program together. I just started thinking about maybe running for mayor one day, because that was the highest office I'd ever seen a Black person hold if they'd run for office. But for me, it was really the moment when I was in college in 1992, after the Rodney King protest, when the mayor of Atlanta and I got into an argument about how effectively they were serving the poor and the young in Atlanta. And I was dissatisfied with his answer. And later that year, he hired me to work for him. It was in that moment I realized that job could solve so many of the problems that I saw. And that was the moment I thought, maybe I'll run for mayor one day.
Well, you've aimed higher, but let me ask you this. What advice do you have for students who are listening tonight who may wish to get involved in politics?
The most important, I think, the most foundational advice is that politics should be a tool for your policy. Policy should never be a tool for your politics. Mm-hmm. And it's hard sometimes to remember the difference, because such cynicism surrounds our politics, surrounds the way our government operates. But the minute we start making choices so we can win elections, instead of winning elections so we can make better choices, mm-hmm. you have fallen far afield from what should be driving you. Mm-hmm. And it's when you remember that dynamic and that order, that order of operation, that you see people better at their work. when I served in the legislature, for me, it was always front and center that my responsibility was to serve people. And it was not my job to make sure I only passed democratic bills to serve people. My job was to get good done and to stop stupid. And even more importantly, to stop mean and evil and wrong. But what that meant, though, was that I worked with the other side. I sometimes adopted their ideas and I helped them get their bills through. And we have come to this place in our politics where everything from the other side must be inherently wrong. And that's just not true. There are some hard and fast lines, like what's happening right on voting rights, that I absolutely have no truck with what they want to do. And there are issues of bodily autonomy. There are issues of access to healthcare, where there is no question that there is a right and a wrong answer. But there is a whole universe of what we can do together. And if you go in believing if you don't get your way, you're not going to do it, then you are taking up space from someone who will do the best they can to serve the people who need that help. And remembering that it's not just the politics that got you there, it's the policies that you're trying to deliver. When that is top of mind, you are better able you should never compromise your values, but you can find ways to work together that accomplish your goals. And that always, I think, should be the driving force and the sort of Jiminy Cricket that chirps in our ears when we enter politics.
Any advice for members of Congress today who seem to be so polarized and so far apart?
I'm actually celebrating the return of earmarks. And here's why. Money makes you compromise. When you have to work together to deliver resources, you are much less likely to respond through demagoguery. You're much more willing to work on compromise. And I think that part of the polarization has happened because, I mean, let's be clear. When I was growing up and when you were younger, we had a common source of information. I remember it was ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS. That's where you got your news. And so there was a common narrative, a common story that we all shared. And that meant our politics had a commonality as well. It's not to say that we haven't always been polarized and had fractures, but there was at least a common truth that we held. With the proliferation of social media and cable, we no longer have even a singular story. We don't even have a common language for what we're hearing. And one of the few things that makes everyone work together is when we want something. And earmarks are one of those ways. It's a very pedestrian and sometimes it seems a grubby way to get things done. But I know that when I was in the legislature, the times we could get things done was when we had to work together to get the money we needed to serve the people we were elected to serve. And so I think that earmarks are one of those places. I mean, it would be better if our higher angels and our moral compasses were stronger, but I'll start with the very, very, very foundational issue of money being a way to get good done.
Well, no bridges to nowhere, but
exactly.
maybe science centers or museums.
There you go.
Republicans in Georgia have long controlled the levers of power. Last Democrat before this year who was elected to the United States Senate was Zell Miller in 2000. No Democrat has occupied the governor's mansion since 2003, and no Democrat has won the presidential contest in Georgia since 1992 up until 2020. What made you think that Democrats could win in Georgia? And tell us about the struggle you went through to convince other people.
So the basic answer is math. I'm pretty good with numbers. When I was elected in 2006, I was elected into the minority, and we were in the minority. This was not a mirage. It wasn't that things were just untapped. We were in the minority. The demographic changes that had started in our state had not come to full fruition. And the conservative ethos was incredibly strong in the South. And we had the sort of terrible arranged marriage in Georgia where people were all Democrats, but not for the same reasons. You had sort of the hyper-conservative, sometimes pejoratively referred to as Dixiecrats. You had urban Democrats. You had people who got lost on their way to Florida. And you sort of had this, and you had, Black and brown people, but mostly Black, who were Democrats. And so when the fracture happened, And when it truly took hold, when Sonny Perdue was elected in 2003, and when we lost the Senate during his first year in office, and we lost the House in the 2004 election, we were truly a Republican state. But I remember looking at demographic charts about the future of the state. And I remember thinking that, in the South, race is the strongest predictor of your political leanings. And so looking at the racial trajectory of Georgia, it was very clear that that shift was going to hit the state of Georgia in about 15 years. So I was in the legislature in 2006. But on top of that was the reality that I understood, which is that there were thousands of Georgians who had never been contacted, had never been touched by politics, although they were always the victim of political machinations. I grew up in a family like that. My parents never missed an election. They would take us with them to vote. I once described it like we looked like make way for ducklings as we trailed outside of the voting booth. I do not recall a single politician ever knocking on my parents' door, because we lived in a neighborhood and in a community where we weren't expected to be part of the political space. And if no one asks you to participate, if you come from communities that have been so often distanced, not just from the reality of campaigning and voting, but from from receiving the benefits of engagement, you don't participate. So for me, it was about building, one, a democratic narrative that actually spoke to people where they were. And I got a lot of that language and the way I thought about it from my parents during their tenure when they were becoming pastors and during their tenure as ministers. But the second part was there were going to be more people who thought like me, and we should probably try to get them to vote. And so I put together in 2010, I put together this 10-year plan, and it really did track the trajectory of voting and the trajectory of demographic changes. And it accelerated because of in-migration, the reverse migration of the great migration to the Northeast, but burgeoning populations of API and Latin American, but also young people growing at one of the fastest rates in the country. All of those pieces were coming together, and it wasn't just Atlanta, it was the state. And so a lot of my work was really grounded in doing what my parents said as ministers: meet people where they are. I read a lot of theological texts about how do you grow a church. And I thought, I'm going to grow the church of progress, and we're going to do the work to get people to be engaged. And so it was doing that work that led to a lot of the outreach that I built, both as leader, organizations that I started, including the New Georgia Project, investment in younger people to go into community and build operations, but also training them to run campaigns and to think about policy. And so over the course of a decade, and I brought in, got introduced to one of my dearest friends and my colleague and partner in this work, Lauren Grow-Wargo, and together we built out this 10-year plan, and apparently 10 years was the charm.
And you wrote a wonderful article laying out sort of what you did together. I can't remember what journal I read it in, but it was. But let me ask you this: how do you take that to scale? How do you take that to other states and make this about more than the state of Georgia? So
the piece you're referencing, we wrote it. It was in the New York Times, and I want to say that I push back on the idea of scaling it. I think about it instead as a franchise model, and this is the problem with being an entrepreneur. Scale is trying to build the largest entity possible. Franchising it is taking the core of it and making it and replicating it, but making it adapt to where you situate it.
Mm-hmm.
Democracy, unfortunately, in our country, democracy differs based on where you live. The rules are different, access is different, the needs are different. And some of that's good, some of that's bad, and some of it's neutral. It's not really the point. But for me, the responsible thing to do is to look at the states that have the opportunity to change engagement and to scale that investment to make it so. And the three pieces are this. One, you have to have not just an organizing universe, but they've got to have the resources to do their work. In Georgia, that meant LGBTQIA, communities of color, communities serving the poor, labor, dealing with environmental groups. It was bringing all of those together and creating an ecosystem, not where we agreed on everything, but where we all agreed that we needed more people in the process and more people who had stake in what we did. And that can be replicated in other places. The second piece is that you cannot wait for presidential years. Presidential years are the most remote of elections. They turn out the highest number, but the return on investment is so low because for most people, the challenges that they face in their lives, for the communities we need to engage, they feel the pain at the local level. It's whether or not the school board decided that they needed access to the internet when they decided to go to remote learning, and whether you had your kids in a school system where they actually made sure you had access to the internet for the last year of your child's education, or if they left it up to you and you're sitting outside a McDonald's in your car hoping you can get a signal so your kid doesn't fall behind by a year. That's decided by who gets elected to your school board. It's making sure that your city council and your mayor make the right choices about the investments they make in the police force and that they have an accountability track. It's making sure that the zoning decisions made by your county allow for affordable housing. And it's about making sure your state legislature is not operating to strip you of the most basic and fundamental of rights. And that's what we've watched happen, unfortunately, across the country. And so what I would say is take the organizing model, but also make sure you understand the needs of your people and localize that work. And then number three, know it's going to take time. If you promise instant results and that you cannot deliver, people start to disbelieve you. I always underpromised and sometimes I barely delivered, but I was always very clear about what we could or could not do. Yeah. And I always came back and said, okay, and it was not just to the people who gave us money. I went back to the groups that gave us time and I said, look, here's what I thought we could do. Here's what we got done. Here's what we didn't get done. And here's the gap. And if I'm the problem, here's what I've done to solve me. And if it's an external problem, here's what we're going to do to fix it. But it's being in constant conversation, but it is absolutely achievable. But people have to do it where they are because what's happening in the Rio Grande in Texas is different than what's happening in the Outer Banks in North Carolina. And that is nothing like what's happening in Kansas City. We've got to build things from where we are. But in every place, I promise you, there are people working hard to make things better. And there are people who are being left out of the conversation. And there is the mechanism to make them believe that they can be a part of success and change. And that means that we have to communicate with them to get it done.
Let's talk a little bit about young people. As you know, we study the political participation of young people at Tisch College. In the presidential race, Georgia had the largest share of 18 to 29-year-old voters. It was approximately 20% of any state in the country. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris had an overall margin of victory in Georgia of 12,000 votes, but among young voters, the margin was 188,000 votes. What were your specific strategies, especially during the conditions of the pandemic, for reaching young people and for motivating them and mobilizing them?
So you'll hear me say this a lot, but most of what we did in 2020 started long before. When I became Democratic leader in 2010, we had a moribund party is the most charitable description. The person who became the chair of our state party was in prison within 3 years. And we had some other challenges. So part of what I saw as my responsibility as leader was to help build the party and to build that party infrastructure. And the reason this is related to young people voting is that you have to use every mechanism possible. And sometimes we eschew the idea of political parties and that apparatus, but it's an amazing organizing model. It is one of the most effective ways to hire young people to learn about politics, but also to do politics. So I made certain that we were part of building an aggressive state party that was very much able to lead the charge through the organizing core that happened through the DNC. But I hired young people every election cycle. I hired them both in the legislative space so they could learn policy. It is not helpful to have people that you're deploying to help change people's minds when they don't know what the problems are and can't tell you how to solve them. So for the course of my 7 years as leader, we had more than 400 interns that we brought in and we trained them on public policy during session. And then we trained them on politics when we were out of session. And that created a whole cadre of operatives who could actually work within their communities to help other young people learn about politics and do the work. Money was also incredibly important. In 2018, when I ran my race for governor, we invested on college campuses, but also with smaller organizations. We put money into young people's hands and said, tell us what you need to do. Tell us what the answer is. Instead of trying to import my memories from 27 years ago, I said, and we said, tell us what you need. Tell us how you would do this. And giving young people the freedom to shape their own communication tools and to give them the freedom to share information in a way that was accessible was transformative. But we also reached across young people, not simply focusing on college. We focused wherever young people were, because not every young person is going to college. Not every young person is employed. And there are some people who simply want to find a way to belong. And we tried to reach them where they were. And one of the ways I did it, look, I went to Dragon Con. I went to one music fest. I was on Spotify and Pandora. I truly believe in the meeting people where they were. And the reason I talk about what we did in 18 was that when I did not become governor, we did not stop. And so instead of this being this episodic instrument where it only works if the person running for office does it, we decided it was going to continue, because whether or not it got me elected, it got them engaged, because we had a 139% increase in youth participation in 2018. And my mission was to increase that number. And that's what we were able to do. And when we had a candidate running for president, when we had our 2 US senators, we constantly made certain that they had a reason to be engaged. And then the most important piece was that what happened in the pandemic, the economic hardship, the healthcare disaster, and the racial injustice, the ability to connect the dots between voter engagement and actual change had never been more real and more salient. And fundamentally, that is how you get young people to vote.
Yep.
Like any other community, people vote when they know that voting can change their lives. And young people in the starkest reality saw what that meant and understood that that was true.
Your persistence, even after you're losing that election, is one of the really extraordinary dimensions of your story. And thank goodness you continue. Women of color are crucial, or have been crucial, to Democrats' success in Georgia, not only in organizing and turning out the vote, but in who actually voted. Exit polls show that 91% of Black women voted for Biden. Women of color, particularly Black women, are often the backbone of Democratic politics, especially in the South. But their work and their agency is systematically overlooked. So how did you and countless others navigate the setbacks and the lack of support that you've had to deal with over the years of doing this kind of work?
I mean, it's an overused phrase, but it is absolutely apropos here. It's an existential issue. Mm-hmm. Almost every societal ill, every social malignancy, every political fallout consequence hits Black women. It hits Black communities. It hits communities of color. We are often the receptacles of the trash of bad policy. We are the victims of bad decision-making, and worse, of intentional decision-making that dehumanizes and discounts our role and our responsibilities and our right to active engagement. And so the persistence is driven by survival instinct. But what is so remarkable and extraordinary is that it has never been about just getting for ourselves. What I have seen happen with communities of color, with women of color in particular, is that there is always a sense of, how can I lift myself and others? Mm-hmm. How can I share my benefit? Among the very first people, after when you see what happened on Tuesday here in Georgia, it was not simply Asian American women standing by themselves. Black women, brown women, indigenous women, we all stood up and said, yes, we have to lift these women up. We have to center their story. And no, we don't have to wait for a confession of racism to see racism where it is. It's because we know, one, there's an empathy. There's a there but for the grace of God that drives all of our politics. But it's also the reality that we have seen progress. It has been slow. It has been plodding. It has not been sustained, but it has happened. And I think it is also this notion that we are responsible for the next generation in both a biological, but also in a cultural way. That means that we don't have the luxury of just abandoning ship. We've got to keep going because we see the shore and we believe that there is a space for us when we get there.
I want to open it up to the audience in a moment, but let me just ask you one last question about voter suppression. So across 43 states, there are over 250 bills being considered by state legislatures that would, in the name of preventing voter fraud, place additional burdens and restrictions on people's ability to exercise the right to vote. The New Georgia Project, which you mentioned a moment ago, which you founded, claims that Georgia is ground zero for attacks on voting rights. What's happening there, and what's the strategy for preventing the Republican-controlled legislature in Georgia from enacting these laws?
So New Georgia Project was an organization I started in 2014 to begin to register the, at that time, 800,000 unregistered Black and brown people in the state of Georgia. I created, after the election in 2018, I created Fair Fight, which has been the hub of focus for fighting back against voter suppression, both in Georgia and nationally. And so it is not hyperbole to say that Georgia is ground zero, because of those 253 bills, more than 50 of them are coming from the state of Georgia. Just last night, at the at the very tail end of the legislative day, the chair of the House committee that is overseeing these bills introduced an omnibus 93-page bill that is the worst Frankenstein apparition of dismantling voting access that I have seen. And I've seen terrible bills move through the state. These bills are seeking to do two things. One is to target with surgical precision the ways that communities of color and young people, and let's be clear, it's both, the ways communities of color and young people were able to access the right to vote and change the outcome of an election in ways that they had not anticipated. We'd been telling them we were going to do it, but they didn't believe us. And because we were able to mitigate voter suppression between 2018 and 2020 through litigation, legislation, and advocacy, more people of color, more young people were able to make it through the gauntlet of voter suppression and cast their votes. What they are attempting to do right now is to close every one of those openings and to restore us to a time when the right to vote had to be fought for, through protest. And so it is very intentionally designed to undermine those communities. But the other piece, and this is happening in Georgia, but also nationwide, and the reason I want to emphasize it is that while we are focusing on the racist attack on the right to vote, that is the Jim Crow redux, Jim Crow in a suit and tie that is happening right now, the same thing that's happening across the country is also an attempt to respond to the Electoral College decision. In multiple states, there are bills being moved right now to allow the state legislature to decertify elections, to allow state legislators to take over county independent boards of elections. So essentially what they are trying to do is what they couldn't accomplish on January 6th. And so I am not being hyperbolic at all when I say that the insurrection that failed in January is continuing through legislative imprimatur across the country. We cannot get distracted by the fact that we won those elections, because there is nothing permanent about victories in voting rights. If you doubt that, remember the Selma Bridge that led to the Voting Rights Act, which today is not only has had Section 5 eviscerated, but Section 2 is under attack and likely to be dismantled after this session of the Supreme Court.
I've noticed that one of the strategies is to try to reach out to corporations who support members of the legislature and who have said nice things about racial justice, whatever, but that are headquartered in Georgia, like Coca-Cola or Delta. Do you think, how are you going about that?
So right now, that facet of the fight is being led by NGP, by Black Voters Matter, and a coalition of organizations, NAACP. I think that is a critical piece, because if these businesses believe their rhetoric, then we have to see them stand on the right side of this issue. This is not just about who wins an election. Democracy is not partisan. It is the ability to cast a vote. Our decisions may be partisan, but our process cannot be. Because when our process is partisan, then people are denied their right to vote. And I'm going to connect it with what just happened in Georgia with the murders of those women. When you target communities of color, when you deny them the agency of being able to elect representatives who see and feel their humanity, who are willing to defend and protect them, when you take away their right to vote, you make it even more possible for their vulnerabilities to be exploited. That's what happens. Voting is not just about the act of casting a ballot. It's the choice of leadership. It is the ability to decide your future. And if we are going to condemn racial inequality, if we are going to condemn hate crimes based on race, if we are going to condemn hate being the progeny of our society, then we have to have the ability to elect people who share those values. And it's the business community's responsibility, because they are corporate citizens and they should be held to account just like every other voter.
We're now going to go to our first questioner from the audience. Raksha, you want to, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, you want to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Hi, my name is Raksha, and I'm a sophomore at Tufts studying international relations and psychology. And firstly, I just wanted to thank you so much for speaking with us today. Your words are so inspiring. My question is, what do you think are the biggest barriers to participate in civic action, and how can we combat them?
Thank you so much, Raksha. So the first barrier is that we have to do the basic work of connecting the dots. When you ask someone to be engaged, they have to know why. And we often skip from the why to the what. We ask them to do something and we tell them when to do it. But if we don't connect the dots in real, tangible ways, it's hard to get people to risk themselves and risk their emotions. And what I mean by that is civic action takes hope. You have to believe that if I do it, something can get better. But if I don't believe that, then why would I try? And so we have to be very intentional about the granular nature of civic engagement, that it's going to take time, that it is hard, but that it does work. And we have to talk about what success looks like. If success is that we're going to dismantle poverty and eradicate racism, that can seem so far away that it doesn't make sense to start. But if we can make it granular and talk about this is the macro, but here's the micro example of what we're going to do, we can get people to engage. That's why when I talk about voting, I say voting is not magic, it is medicine. It is not going to fix everything, but it's going to make us better, and it's going to make being bad harder. That's why we vote. That's why we engage. That's why we work.
Next questioner is Lindsay.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today. And I mean, I'll echo what Raksha said. Your words are just so inspiring, and I'm so inspired by you. I'm a third-year veterinary student at the vet school here at Tufts, and I'm doing a dual degree with the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. So as somebody who's interested in working in a policy-oriented career, I just wanted to ask you, what is your advice for anyone pursuing a career in public service, and what motivates you in public service?
So I'll start with the second part first. I am motivated by a belief that poverty is immoral and that it is solvable. But I know it's going to take time, and that I can't possibly do it alone, and that it is unlikely to be solved in my lifetime. But I'm emboldened by things like what we saw with the American Rescue Plan that's going to cut poverty in half. It's going to lift half of the children in poverty out of poverty in 2 years. That's an extraordinary thing. And so part of the way to be motivated is to know that you're not going to get everything you seek, but that you can see progress when you work. I was talking to a group of young people from Tufts earlier, and I said, I'm an ameliorist. My mission isn't always victory. My mission is mitigation of harm and the creation of good. And I think when you're in public policy, you have to keep that front and center, because it's going to be hard. And just because good is out there, it doesn't mean bad stops working. And we have to keep both of those things in mind if we want to stay engaged and, more importantly, stay emotionally centered enough to do our part.
Max Finberg, a distinguished alumnus of Tufts University and also a distinguished public servant. Max? No.
And hello, Dean Solomon. Congrats on your pending retirement. And hello, my sister Stacey.
Hello.
Thrilled that you were addressing my fellow jumbos. It was 2 years after I graduated from Tufts that I got to meet Stacey as she put together that plan that we all benefit from now. And as part of that, as someone who, like you, has been inspired to work for change, in my case on hunger and poverty issues as well, I'm wondering what me and my fellow jumbos can help you in your efforts to save our democracy, whether that's a little more about fair fight or what you're working on right now that folks who aren't in Georgia to contact Republican state legislators about the particular bills might be able to do.
Well, first of all, Max, it's always lovely to see you, and give my best to your better half, Kate.
Happily.
So I take credit for part of their marriage coming together. So there you go. Anyway.
You got to elaborate on that.
For a small fee, yes, I will. Anyway, no, what I would say is this. One, even though Georgia is ground zero, this is happening across the country, 43 states. Now, look, there are 23 states that are trifectas, meaning Republicans control both of the houses in their state legislature, as well as the governorship. And in those states, that's where we have the deepest worry. If you go to fairfight.com or stopjimcrow2.com, then we can sign you up and we'll tell you what's happening. And you may live in a state or have friends in that state. We have to remember that constant attention is how we keep these bills, if not from becoming law, then we can at least, again, mitigate some of the harm. But there's also federal legislation. The Senate next week on the 24th will introduce S1, which is the Senate version of the For the People Act. It will not solve every single harm being done by these state bills, but it will, for the first time in American history, establish a universality of who gets to register and how, by creating universal registration, so creating automatic registration, same-day registration, allowing for 2 weeks minimum of in-person early voting, mandating that every state, which is not true right now, allows no excuses absentee balloting. Those 4 changes just by themselves are transformative to our elections. And so we need folks reaching out to your US senators. Do not presume that because they share your political leanings that they are on board. This is a complicated bill, and there are going to be pieces that are moving around. So familiarize yourself. If you go to the Brennan Center, they've got a great summary of S1, HR1, learn about it, push for the parts that you agree with the most. But I will tell you that for me, the passage of S1, HR1, and then HR4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, is the most transformative thing we can do for democracy. Because with automatic registration, same-day registration, and as a corollary, the ending of voting purges, we create for the first time a real foundation where our democracy doesn't differ based on our geography. I should be able to leave Georgia. I'm never going to, but if I were to leave Georgia and go to another state, I shouldn't have to learn the electoral laws of a new state in order to use my citizenship to create change. And S1, HR1, push for it, call about it. And if you go to Fair Fight, we'll give you information, and we look forward to having everybody on board.
And you believe that the filibuster should be eliminated for these kinds of legislative initiatives?
Yes, I would say that we've seen it happen before. We suspended the filibuster for judicial appointments, cabinet appointments. It's suspended for budget reconciliation. There is nothing more foundational than the right to vote. And it's in the Constitution that Congress, Article 1, Section 4, I think it is the elections clause. States have the right to administer elections, but the federal government through Congress alone has the ability to set federal guidelines. And if we set those federal guidelines, it will govern most elections that happen in the country.
Matthew.
Hi, Stacey. My name is Matt Friedberg. I'm from New Jersey, and I'm a first-year student studying international relations. My question is, what are some ways that young people can work to encourage civic action and voter participation, especially during a time in which state legislators are actively constructing barriers to the right to vote?
The most important, first of all, Matt, thank you for the question. The most important issue is recognizing that this is happening to young people, just as the targets are people of color. Young people are absolutely the target. And that means that young people need to pay attention to their state legislators. They should know what's happening. And it's hard to, not only is it hard to pay attention, it's hard to care sometimes, but we have to recognize that many of the choices that affect our lives do not happen at the federal level. They happen at the state level. And so the most important piece is that wherever you're living, get to know the state legislature where you are, and do not presume that because they share your political identity that they share your values. There's a spectrum of democracy, and there's also a spectrum of Democrats and a spectrum of Republicans and independents if you're allowed to be that. So for young people, it's making sure that you focus on where you are, because where you are, you can have the greatest impact. Unless you live in Georgia, in which case keep your attention here. Sorry. So one, pay attention to where you are and be a part of that. But two, talk about politics amongst your friends, not in an adversarial way, but in an informational way. I believe always in starting conversations about politics by asking, how can I help? When people know you care about their needs, they're willing to hear you talk about how their needs can be met. But if it's always either histrionic or guilt-inducing or just annoying, they're not going to engage. I got engaged because my parents raised me to ask how to help. And when I was able to get my friends to pay attention, it was by asking what were their pain points? What were they worried about? What were the issues they needed to answer? And when you can provide that information, especially through social media, the more we regularize this conversation about how politics can help or hurt us, the more likely people are to be engaged and stay engaged long-term.
I think we have time for one last question. Lauren?
Good evening. Thank you so much for your inspiring words and for your passionate and thoughtful engagement and leadership. My name is Lauren Sohair. I'm a sophomore at Tufts studying international relations. My question for you is, does voter suppression in the United States have international consequences? How might efforts to combat voter suppression in the United States help support similar international efforts to promote democracy in places like Myanmar and Hong Kong?
So Lauren, you come up here with the very, very easy question of how do we fix the world? Okay, let me see what I can do. So first of all, yes, I mean, American democracy is often used as a template for other nations. We have the most durable democracy in the world, and it is constantly at risk. We have watched over the last decade a diminution of democratic-led countries. We've watched Turkey and Hungary, topple over into authoritarianism. We're watching the same thing happen in India and in Brazil. We have seen what's happened in the Philippines. Democracies aren't impervious to becoming authoritarian regimes, no matter how old they are. And so our first responsibility is that we have to model what defensive democracy looks like. Because what we learned in the last 4 years is that we are not immune. Our democracy is resilient, but it is fragile. And it is our responsibility to hold ourselves accountable and to have dynamic, thoughtful, and consistent conversations about what's broken and what we need to fix. Number two, voter suppression is not unique to the United States, but it is singular. We are one of the only democratized, industrialized nations that requires individual action to be allowed to vote. We are one of the only nations that creates the hurdles and the impediments that you see in the act of voting. Typically, you only see them in places like Myanmar and in places like Hong Kong, where they are trying to give the facade of voting without the reality of actually making choices. But most fundamentally, when people don't believe that change can come by voting, it diminishes their willingness to defend the right to vote where they are. And so when they see minority communities under attack in the United States, being denied the right to vote. We lose all credibility when we argue for the protection of minority rights abroad. This was true under the Reagan administration. It was true under the Clinton administration. It is true today. When we have to fight to defend minority rights, we have to be seen as protectors where we are. And sadly, in our country, we have a long history of failing that test, but we have an opportunity every single time to be better at it. And I think that is the truest example of what we can do. And it's what young people helped make true. When young people voted in 2020 and in Georgia again in 2021, young people proved that our engagement and our support of minority rights was not just a thematic notion that we throw out there every so often. It was a truth that we held to be dear and important and real, and we were willing to work to preserve it, and it worked. We sent the youngest person in, I think since Kennedy, we sent the youngest person to the US Senate. We sent the first Jewish senator, the first Black senator, and we watched them deliver change. And so young people in particular have the responsibility, but also the opportunity to reinforce the international norms of democracy by participating here so we can be seen abroad as the true protectors of the right to vote and the right to civic engagement.
Stacey Abrams, this has been truly an inspiration, as the students have mentioned. We really appreciate it. We thank you. I had wanted to ask you about your career as a award-winning author, that you write romantic suspense novels. I'm not going to get to ask that, but I will share with the audience that you have another novel coming out this spring. So we're all going to be anxious to go to the bookstore or go to Amazon, wherever we buy our books, and get your next novel. And the next time we see you, I'd like to ask you how you find time to write novels along with everything else. But for now, thank you very much. Thanks to our audience for showing up and listening, and you've given us a lot of inspiration to follow, to try to help you and work together to fix our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you all at Tufts. Thank you, Dr. Gallagher. Take care all.
Bye now.